And we now have a session where we really wanted to highlight work we've done over the past 8 months. It was a collaboration between the Munich Security Conference, from which we have Wolfgang Ischinger, who I'll introduce in a minute, Aspen, our group, the Aspen Strategy Group, and Emeritus, which is a European think tank, on thinking through what the US and Europe can do together about the rise of China. And we wrote a report that I hope you will all see. We will also put it on our website. It'll be available, called Mind the Gap. And to introduce that report and draw out some of its conclusions, we have first Wolfgang Ischinger, who of course needs no introduction. He's currently the chairman of the Munich Security Conference and has been since 2008. And then previously to that was a distinguished diplomat in the German government, holding many, many positions, but of course also state secretary, and was the ambassador to the United States when I met him a long, long time ago as a young diplomat myself. Joe Nye, who's the chairman of our Aspen Strategy Group, but more importantly, Professor Emeritus of the Harvard Kennedy School, formerly the Dean of the Harvard Kennedy School, and a distinguished diplomat in his own right, of course, serving as Assistant Secretary of Defense, Deputy Undersecretary of State, and many, many other roles. Joe and Wolfgang, will you join me here, please?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good.
Yeah. Wonderful. That's great. Hi, Wolfgang. Hi, Joe. And Wolfgang, thank you for doing this late in the afternoon. I know it's getting late for the Europeans. And you see the Aspen background. Next time we'll be back in real live in Aspen. We look forward to welcoming you there.
I sure look forward to my next stay in Aspen. I've been to Aspen a good number of times, both in summer and winter, and I just wish I could be there this year again. Well, let's look forward to 2022. Maybe that will be possible again. So thanks for having me on this session. It's a fascinating subject matter of enormous importance for the transatlantic relationship. And I'm very proud having been invited to do this together with Joe Nye and so many other outstanding personalities.
Great. Well, Wolfgang, will you just introduce and explain the origins of the project and a little bit about what we sought to achieve?
Sure, I'll be happy to do that, Anja. Well, let me start by making the obvious point. China, I think that was a point of departure on which all of us agreed. China has emerged as one of the principal challenges for the cohesion of the transatlantic community going forward. Now, we do not have at this point an institutional framework to deal with all an institutional transatlantic framework to deal with all the questions that arise in dealing with a China that has obviously emerged as a far more present and even aggressive player on the international scene. So we thought that an attempt to examine the nature of the transatlantic challenge, as far as China is concerned, could be hopefully an important contribution as our leaders bilaterally and between the United States and the European Union or in the G7 examine their options going forward. So half a year ago, we started this project together with the Aspen Strategy Group and together with the think tank Merix based in Berlin. And this report, which we issued just a few weeks ago, concludes 6 months of really intensive work. I'm really proud of the contributions, of the input provided by so many experts and political leaders who were willing to participate in this group. So, I think my personal point of departure was when President Biden spoke at our special Munich Security Conference event, virtual event, obviously, last February, when he said, and I quote, I've noted this down, he said, the US and its allies need to, quote, prepare for a long-term strategic competition with China, end of quote. And the question is, of course, how much convergence is there between the Europeans and the EU on the other side of the Atlantic and the United States on this side of the Atlantic? Let me put it this way. If it was easy for us to agree on how to deal with China, we would not have needed to prepare this report. Obviously, there are serious issues. Obviously, our interests between Europe on the one hand and the United States on the other are not identical. We come to these issues from very different economic, historical, political, and other angles. So the question is, how can we, and through which instruments and on which issues can we create even more convergence and try to coordinate a stronger position, a transatlantic position, rather than acting individually. That's why we titled this report, Mind the Gap. Transatlantic convergence on China, in my view, should not be taken for granted. The group, 21 personalities from both sides of the Atlantic, tried to identify in this group a number of issues that would hopefully lend themselves to quote unquote quick wins, to where we could develop hopefully transatlantic measures that could have a meaningful and a noticeable impact over the next 6 to 18 months. In other words, we focused on what can be done in the short term and not only on those issues that would make a difference in 5 or 10 or 15 years. The report covers many of these issues. And finally, one of the points which emerged, which is really an interesting point, is when you look for these quote unquote quick wins, you find that some of these issues that appear on the agenda are not really things that we should do with or about China, but that refer to issues that we should do together. For example, getting rid of transatlantic trade disputes. For example, getting rid of
easier said than done, but yes. Yeah.
Etc. That's an easy one for everyone to understand. But it's of course easy to say that for me here today, much harder to do. And I'm sure we'll be talking about that in the next 15, 20 minutes, etc. Maybe I should stop here, Anja, and just let me conclude by saying that I'm extremely proud that all of these busy personalities that participated in the group were really eager to provide input and to not only be listed as a participant, but really work hard to come up with meaningful proposals. It's been a real pleasure for me to work with Joe and a number of others, including, of course, yourself, Anja, representing the Aspen Strategy Group. And let me also say that we could not have started this project with some meaningful support from the German Foreign Ministry that was interested in getting us going. So I'll stop here for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to turn it over to Joe to start diving a little bit into the substance of the report. But let me just tell one anecdote, because we have 8 different chapters in here on different aspects: economic security, technology, institutions, democracy. And for each subchapter, we had at least one American and one European co-author. And it became very clear very quickly that we had different assumptions about things and that there was still a little bit of a gap between us. In the middle of writing this report, several of the European participants were actually sanctioned by the Chinese government. And I think that had a real effect to bring us even more closely together and think, wow, this is an important issue and something where there should be more convergence. So Joe, will you tell us a little bit about the chapter that you co-authored on international institutions, because that's one of the key areas where, of course, the competition with China is joined.
Thanks, Anja, and also note that what a pleasure it is to work with Wolfgang. I was also very pleased by the fact that our working group with MSc and NERCS had fewer differences than I expected. In others, there are differences, as Wolfgang said, but there was a surprising degree of agreement. And I should reassure people that nobody was seeking a new Cold War. There's been a lot of talk about decoupling of the US and Europe and China. That wasn't the idea. You can't, in the real Cold War, there was a high degree of a low degree of economic interdependence, which is not true, or with China is a high degree. And there's also a lot of ecological interdependence with China, things like climate change and pandemics. So nobody was looking for a new Cold War. On the other hand, there are places where we are going to have to decouple for security reasons. A good example of this is something like Huawei and fifth generation telecommunications. And that then leads to the point that if the US and Europe pull together, this general view that China is taking over the world economically is not true. In fact, China won't equal the US and Europe in terms of the share of the global economy for a long time to come. But the question is whether the US and Europe will pull together. And there, I think, if we look at the challenge that China has posed, it has really tried to take international institutions, or take the existing rules-based institutions, and tilt them in their favor. The way it's treated the World Trade Organization is a good case in point. So the questions that we faced in looking at institutions was, there are some areas where we're going to have to get China to play by the rules. There are other areas where we're going to have to go ahead on our own, where essentially one size is not going to fit all. And so in our recommendations in this area, what we said is we've got to begin a US-European dialogue of how we're going to behave inside international institutions. And we're also going to have to coordinate ways of pushing back against some of the initiatives that Chinese have taken in the institutions. A case in point is on personnel issues. 4 out of the 15 major agencies of the UN are now being run by Chinese citizens. And we haven't spent enough attention to that. For example, in the International Telecommunications Union, which will play a major role in setting up standards that relate to the future of the internet, we haven't paid enough attention to the problems of getting the right to standards, getting American and European companies to work together to attend meetings to get the right standards and so forth. So the recommendations we had is that we should create a working group, transatlantic working group, to coordinate our policies in institutions, running everything from issues like trade to standards to questions of personnel. In those terms, then, we thought that we had a fairly good chance of being able to shape a rules-based international order. And it's one where you can leave it open for Chinese participation, but you're not going to wait just for China to set the pace on it. So there, I think we've seen some encouraging signs of this kind of coordination. We saw it at the G7 meeting, at the NATO summit, at the US-European summit, and we're hoping that, that our report, Mind the Gap, will provide a series of particular recommendations for how we can work to push this forward. So I'll leave it there, but I think it's a crucial area for us to work on together. There are differences, but there are also greater similarities. And I think we've seen some promising indications that we can build on this.
Thank you, Joe. That's great. I'll just follow up from that and say a couple of words about the technology chapter, which I co-authored with Maurice Shaka and others. We talked a lot about how there aren't really the right tools to coordinate technology policy between the US and Europe, and actually spoke to some diplomats in the European Commission, some members of the Biden administration, people who are working on this. And there's actually really positive news there. So the EU-US Trade and Technology Council was created earlier this year. At first, it was really just an idea, but that idea is beginning to be filled out with real policies underneath. So it'll be chaired by Margareta Vestager and Dombrovskis. And on the US side, Gina Raimondo, our Secretary of Commerce, is really taking a leading role along with Catherine Tai and Tony Blinken. And I know from background discussions that they're already thinking very carefully about what they can do. And some of those things are things that are also incorporated in our recommendations. For example, can you do more joint research and development on the key technologies where we need to stay ahead in the race with China, specifically semiconductors? I know there's some conversation about setting up a semiconductor research center in the US and that it would coordinate with the European one that already exists. Is there some conversation about doing better to coordinate export controls? Not in everything, we won't be able to do that, but there are certain areas where the US and Europe are so far ahead that we really should be doing it together. And excuse me, sorry, someone's walking in behind me. And then finally, can we do more work on, Joe, you already mentioned standard setting, but can we do something on artificial intelligence, especially the ethics around that, where people are only starting to think it through? But I know that there are people both in Europe and the US working on that, both from the government side and the private sector side. So that gives our audience a little bit of a flavor of the kinds of recommendations we made in the report. But Wolfgang, I wanted to turn back to you, because one of the things we wrote and something that the American participants really realized through participating in this project is that Europeans are still more reluctant than North Americans about confronting China. Survey after survey shows that, and especially in the economic area. Can you say a little bit more about the European perspective? Why is that the case? And is it particularly true in certain European countries rather than others?
Absolutely. This is a fascinating aspect of our work. The perceptions that existed and continue to exist to some extent on both sides, and how, to what extent, and why they differ. Well, Anja, let me start by saying you're right. There are important differences, and rather obvious ones, in the economic area. But there are, of course, also rather obvious, significant differences in the military, strategic, political area. As it happens, the United States of America, this is something we Europeans have to recognize, happens to have to be a Pacific power, and the United States has military, not only a military presence, but has military commitments in the regions. We, as members of the European Union or as European members of NATO, do not have, maybe with rare exceptions, France, of course, has military interests and has a presence in the South Pacific. The UK, which used to be a member of the European Union, also, but the rest of us really don't. So obviously that creates a very different lens through which you look at these areas. Now, to come back to your question on the economic issues, let me offer a very frank observation on what used to be, until actually quite recently, German and to some extent the European approach to China. It was, how can we sell the maximum number of automobiles or machinery or other equipment to China? And then we had a human rights dialogue to accompany this. It only occurred to Europe in recent years because China changed, because Chinese foreign policy changed through the Belt and Road Initiative and through, Hong Kong and human rights issues, et cetera, et cetera. Look, it dawned on us that that is not a sufficiently comprehensive approach to China. But the fact remains, dependencies have developed, economic dependencies have developed that are significant. One example is the very important German automobile sector, a key element of Germany's prosperity. All of the major German automobile companies, whether it's Volkswagen or BMW or Mercedes-Benz, sell up to 40% or even a little more of their products in China. So this has become a market which to them, to these companies, has become more important than individual European markets. That happens to be a fact. So we need to balance the question of what do we do about that? Can we work to protect us maybe a little better against this kind of rather serious dependency, economic dependency, export dependency? And if so, how? And how can we work with a country that is also economically tied very closely with China, but in a somewhat different way, the United States? So this is why this report is intellectually so enormously attractive. And let me conclude by repeating what I tried to say in the beginning. This, in my view, is probably going to be the #1 issue for the cohesion of the transatlantic community going forward over the next, not only 2 or 3 years through the lifespan of the Biden administration, but it will probably remain the principal or one of the principal challenges to the transatlantic community over the next 10, 15, or even 20 years. And that's why this is so important. And I hope that our report will be taken forward by our governments and examined, and that they will examine the various proposals which you, Anja, already presented on tech and which Joe presented on international institutions, etc. There are a number of other areas that we cover in this report. It's really a comprehensive attempt at covering most, if not all, of the bases that matter in this regard.
Yeah, thank you, Wolfgang. Joe, I want to turn to you on the U.S. side, but Wolfgang, one quick follow-up. We were actually with the UK ambassador to the U.S. last night, and she said, she has said publicly that the UK is thinking about China more strategically and not just from an economic perspective. And I think it's maybe a little farther along the convergence with the US than Germany is. And can I just ask you one follow-up? You have an election coming up. Everyone is curious about who the new German chancellor will be. And if it's Armin Laschet, who's now leading in the polls, do you think he's likely to be more on the same page with the US on China or less so?
Well, quite frankly, I think that our political class not only, you know, the CDU, Armin Laschet's party, but throughout the political class in Germany and also in our neighboring countries, perceptions and thinking about China has, of course, changed significantly. Don't forget, in 2019, it was only 2.5 years ago, the European Union decided on its own that we should look at China not only as a cooperation partner, but as a competitor. And that is exactly the same word that the Biden administration is using, but also as a quote unquote systemic rival. And by recognizing that the freedom of navigation is an important value in and of itself to a country that exports more than any other medium-sized country, my country, Germany, we believe the freedom of navigation is an important issue, and we should signal that. And that is why, as we speak, literally, yesterday, I think a German frigate, for the first time, left a German port to go on a long voyage through, you know, the Indian Ocean and to the Pacific region, and will also demonstrate our participation in a collective Western effort to make sure that the high seas are going to be respected as demanded by international law, and that Chinese claims to parts of these waters in the South China Seas will continue to be challenged by the international community as far as we are concerned. So our thinking has evolved, and I think regardless of who is going to be voted in to be the next chancellor in September, German policy and EU policy is going to shift, is going to continue to shift in the direction of slightly more convergence with the United States, but of course not to a point where we can say now our interests are perfectly aligned and identical, and we can just sort of sit back and let things roll. It will continue to be a difficult negotiating process to figure out how the transatlantic community can manage these differences in interests and in economic dependencies. But I think we're all aware that if we approach these issues together, we'll probably be better off talking to our Chinese partners than if we try to do it separately.
Thank you. Joe, you do advise the Biden administration and every other previous US presidential administration at the highest levels. Having, you know, been through this project and learned how there's still real differences. And, you know, we made difficult recommendations like the US and EU should remove their trade disputes. How would you advise the American government to approach this to have the highest chance of a real joint policy towards China?
Well, it's obviously going to take both top level, in other words, presidential summitry level, but also day-to-day hard work at the agency level. So it's not a one-time one for all. But I think just to echo something that Wolfgang said, what strikes me as interesting is the extent to which European policy, in particular German policy, has changed in a direction of convergence. As he mentioned, 20 years ago, what was German policy toward China? How do you sell as much as you can to China? Compare that with what we put in the report today, with full agreement of our German members, a sentence on human rights recommending that governments should downplay their involvement with the 2022 Tokyo Olympics, and companies should downplay their role, not a complete boycott, but as a notification to the Chinese that their behavior in Xinjiang and Hong Kong is unacceptable. I can't imagine that being in a US-European statement 20 years ago. Similarly, there's a statement in the report, which I will read, supporting Taiwan and preparing for contingencies. The idea of a major German statement which would include Taiwan, 20 years ago, is out of the question. So in that sense, what we're seeing is a realization on the part of Europeans that even if it were limited to wanting to sell things to China, if there's a crisis in the Taiwan Straits, then you really will be in Cold War II. And if the chances of that not having a terrible effect on the European and American and world economies are very, very slim. And so in addition to the values question of human rights and the question of how do you prevent a crisis which could escalate in the Taiwan Strait, we're seeing a broadening of the agenda. And that's why, as the American government deals with Europe on this, it's not going to be left to the special trade representative or the Department of Commerce. It's really going to have to be across the board.
That's right. Absolutely. Well, we've got a couple of questions from the audience that I want to make sure get in here. And I think the first one is from Doug Beck, who's a senior executive at Apple and a great friend of the Aspen strategy group, and I know very engaged on these issues. Doug?
Thanks, Anja. First, I want to commend all of you for this incredibly important report that you're putting out and for all the work that goes behind it. And I wanted to foot stomp in particular, Anja, the work that you talked about a little bit and the importance of the collaboration around the technology piece of this, both in dealing with implications of China's activity sort of in a defense way together, but even more importantly, in finding ways to collaborate to go on offense and doing that really together across the US and Europe in the ways that we can collaborate. The question that I have really goes a little bit back to something, Joe, that you were talking about a moment ago, which is how, while we're doing that and how we're looking, as we're looking to collaborate in technology, how we ensure that we get out of our own way of ways in which domestic policies in both the US and Europe. So for example, Digital Markets Act in Europe, things like that, that may, whether they're trade issues or whether they may be regulatory issues that can end up potentially weakening the ability of some of those, that kind of the public-private collaboration or some of the progression of technological leadership, and also put some sand in the gears of the partnership in that critical technology space, and how we help to ensure that we've got a bit more of a balance in the way that we think about some of these issues that really could prove strategic, even if they might sometimes feel like very domestic policy.
Right. Wolfgang, do you want to talk about the Digital Markets Act? And then I think I have two other questions. Thanks, Doug.
Well, all I will say at this point, and thank you very much, Doug, for what I think is really one of the key questions that we need to talk about. The European Union has developed a good capability to be an effective regulator. So, regulating appears to be one of our fortes, so to speak. The question is, what do we do about defending our interests? And that is why I think that the European Union will benefit hugely in the issues that you've just approached and that Anja talked about earlier. If we can actually get our act together and have a continuing discussion between not only the government authorities, the EU authorities, and Biden administration people. We have a proposal in this report which refers to the idea that maybe we should have a kind of a CEO coordinating advisory body across the Atlantic on some of these issues. And I happen to believe that that is one of the better ideas in this report, which deserves to be taken forward.
Thank you. I have one more quick question from one of our rising leaders, Josh, and then I know we have a hard stop in a couple minutes. Josh, are you there?
In that, particularly the South China Sea is on one side. There's a lot of trade that's dependent upon by a lot of the countries in that area, but on the other side, there is a huge dependence on the U.S. military support as far as freedom of navigation goes. With that being said, and speaking of the high seas, freedom of navigation, innocent passage and everything, what are your thoughts on as far as the U.S. signing on to the United Laws of the Sea Convention? And if that is possible to be done, if not, what are things that other signatures could do to make it more palatable to the U.S. government to consider signing on?
Thanks, Josh.
Well, I will take a quick crack on it. We've tried to have the U.S. Senate ratify the Law of the Sea Convention for over 30 years, and chairs of the Joint Chiefs of Staff have appealed to the Senate for this and so forth. It's not likely to change soon, but notice that the U.S. has declared that the provisions of the Law of the Sea Convention are now customary international law. And therefore, we have based our freedom of navigation operations on the existence of that customary international law, which is codified for most countries in the International Law of the Sea Convention, and was reaffirmed in 2016 by the Hague Tribunal on the Law of the Sea. So the U.S. is way out of step by not ratifying the UN Convention, but we don't have to wait until that ratification before we can cooperate with our European allies in treating this as an international law of the sea situation, which supports FONUPs.
That's exactly right.
Anja,
yeah.
Can I just add a European or a German footnote to this freedom of navigation question and the issue here? I've heard many times from Europeans the question, why do we need to worry about these types of territorial or international legal disputes in a faraway place called the South China Seas? Well, my very short answer is, if there was ever a real conflict breaking out in this part of the world affecting the freedom of navigation, the lights would probably go out overnight in places like Wolfsburg, which is where the Volkswagen factory is, or in Munich, where the BMWs are being produced, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, the message to my public on the European side is, it actually matters, because our economic interests, our political interests, of course, also our values will be enormously affected by anything that's going to happen. Hopefully it will not happen, but by anything that's going to happen in this part of the world. We need to educate our public, which has in the past not regarded the South China Seas as something that we ought to be worrying about, as something that we should be worrying about.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Wolfgang, and thank you, Joe. I think this report is a perfect example of how institutions like Aspen and Munich can create policy and drive policy forward in a really positive way. And we could not have a better segue to our next session, which is the view from the Indo-Pacific Command.